Safecast, the power of citizen science. And it's being presented by a guy with a very diverse background as Pieter Franken. He's a senior advisor at Monex, which is a foreign exchange company that provides currency exchange and international payments. He's also a senior visiting researcher at the blockchain lab at Miralab, and also co-founder and general director of Safecast in Japan. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Pieter Franken.
Welcome. Okay, good afternoon. It's after lunch. I'm jet lagged. I'm going to do my best. So, before I start, I want to very quickly add on a little bit to my own story. I'm from Holland. I was born here near Rotterdam. I went to Japan more than 25 years ago. I worked most of my professional career in Japan and in the US. And as you know, 7 years ago, we had a huge tsunami in Japan that triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster. It so happens that my in-laws, my family in-laws, are from the city that was in the center of the tsunami. And when the tsunami hit the coastlines of Japan, I was in Tokyo. We were basically trying to figure out what was happening, and on TV we saw the massive tsunami hit the hometown of my wife. And the height of the waves in that town were 5 stories high, so it's very hard to imagine the power of that, but the power of that is tremendous. So when I saw that personally, a big feeling of helplessness and a sense of to do something. So the next, in the hours after the earthquake, we started to think through, well, how can we get to Fukushima? How we can get to the north of Japan? How can we help our families? What can we do? So as that was happening, the Fukushima nuclear disaster happened, and within 24 hours, after the massive wall of water, we had this invisible wall of radiation that was in between myself and my family in-law in the north of Japan. So that kind of triggered the start of Safecast. Together with 2 other people, we decided to do something about the lack of information that happened at that time, and that became the Safecast project. And I've prepared a little video, and I want to basically give you, it's a 3-minute video, but it gives you a good idea of the project and the people involved, and it basically does a much better job than me talking about it. Here it goes.
So the 3 of us are just talking, where can we find information? Oh, we can't find radiation data anywhere, and it's not because it's not being published, it's because it doesn't exist. Nobody was paying attention to this stuff. And so that's when we decided that we could start pooling our resources to get equipment in people's hands and go collect some of this data and publish it so that there would at least be something available. Within a week, we had 25 people all in this Skype chat room brainstorming and trying to figure out a solution to this problem.
We're looking online and we couldn't get any Geiger counters. Literally within 24 hours, the whole world supply was sold out. When we realized that we couldn't get the equipment, we decided that the only way to get this done is let's go and build it ourselves. So we came up with the idea that if we put a Geiger counter on a car and we drive around with it, we can collect radiation and put it on the map. Only problem was we didn't have the equipment, we didn't have the system. So solution was go to Tokyo Hackerspace, where there's lots of people that knew how to put things together. And on the 6th day after we had the idea, we had a working system. The next day we were off to Fukushima doing our first measurements.
As we started taking measurements, we saw that a reading can change like 100% just by crossing a street. And that's when we realized that it was really important for us to take very granular street by street readings every 5 seconds and publish really granular data so that people can drill all the way down and see exactly what the reading is right in front of their house, not an average of the entire city.
After a couple of months, we realized that it would be much better for volunteers to have something that would be very concise and compact. As we redeveloped the whole system, and we were able to use Arduinos and open hardware to fit it into a bento box, and that is how we came up with the bento Geiger system. Once we built one, we taught other people to build many more of them, and that really allowed us to scale up dramatically.
While this is a disaster, this is a tremendous opportunity to take this tons of data that's being collected and try to understand what the effects on people is. That can only happen if we share the data and we put the medical data together with the radiation data. And right now the key to combining data is to make it open. And so one of the really important features of the Safecast project is we're using a CC0, public domain dedication, for all of the data so that we can try to get people to do data science on it. We found out from Fukushima that the experts really weren't very helpful, and in fact that citizen science actually works. We were able to collect more data than all the projects in history, and a lot of scientists came together, and by pulling through the network we were able to become the best in the world. So I think what Safecast proves is that all the preparation in the world, all the money in the world still fails if you don't have a rapid, agile, resilient system. Because of the internet, because of our agility, because of our openness, within weeks we had the world's experts together to do this, and within a year we're the biggest project that has ever existed in this kind of monitoring. And I think it really shows that with the right people and the right resources and agility, you can beat the pants off of any government pre-planning or institutional system.
Okay, so this gives you an idea where we were about 7 years ago, actually 6.5 years ago. And today I want to talk about a few aspects of the project. One is going to be around the data we collected and what it basically shows you. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the infrastructure or the ecosystem of Safecast in terms of devices, etc. I also want to spend some time as to what are kind of our fundamental principles of how we collect data and how can we create trustworthy data. The last bit I will talk about is some principles we have learned along the way, practical insights of how do you run a project like this for so many years. It actually is quite challenging, but there's also some kind of rules that we discovered that actually make it much easier to do this type of project. So, very quickly about the project today. Today we have collected measurements around the world. We have data from over 100 countries. We have collected 85 million measurements, or 85 million locations worldwide. All of that is public domain, which means that you can download this data from our website. You don't have to even fill a form to get it. And the data is the raw data from the sensor, so you can do everything on it the same as we can do on our website. As far as I know, it's the largest ever kind of citizen science project that is focused on environmental monitoring that has been around for this long, 7 years. We're still 7 years and counting. We've never been as strong as we are today. We have thousands of devices in the field around the world. We started in Japan with 1 Geiger counter. We now have a couple of thousand of these devices being used by volunteers. I think some of you in the audience are actually our volunteers. I'm not sure I can point a few people in the room that have built our systems and are using them here in Europe or in the US. We have many, many volunteers that operate our system. Many of our volunteers share the devices in their communities. We don't want to depend on single sources. We don't want to do closed data, etc. This is the opposite of what the Safecast project stands for. It's very important to mention our project. We are not a company. We are a non-profit organization, and we are largely volunteer-driven even today. So a little bit about our ecosystem. So how does it work? If we kind of look here, quite straightforward. On the one side, we have all kind of sensors, and we have 2 types of sensors that we use. One that are mobile. These are primarily designed to be put on cars, can be put on bicycles, backpacks, etc. as well. But most of our measurements are done by driving through public roads, and that's how we get our measurements. We also have stationary sensors, and today I brought some of them with me. This is actually one that the Things Network is using here. I'm going to talk about it a little bit further. And this is one that we very recently built, and you're one of the first ones to see it. So data goes either through the internet or Wi-Fi, LoRaWAN, or 3G connections to gateways that run in the cloud. We have an API where the data ends up on, and then it is stored in storage nodes. So this is kind of how the data is collected. After that, we have an entirely separate system that actually does visualization and data processing, which is decoupled from the system that receives the data. And that is to make sure that the system is very, very resilient in case we are attacked by something. I want to show you some of our data. So most of our data that you're going to see has been collected by the BGeiger, which you saw in the video. This is the current version. It's smaller and it is better and it is sexier. But this is what most of our volunteers use today. It is a kit. So most people build it themselves and they put it together and then they go on the road. So to recenter this, I'm sure you can see this. This is the map of Japan. This is our interactive map. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly zoom in, and as I do that, you will get an idea of the granularity of the data that we have collected. And all the blue, the dark blue, is what I would call normal background radiation levels, which is actually, you can see here 0.12 microsieverts per hour. This is basically what we see here in Amsterdam as well. This is Tokyo, this is where I live, and I'm going to zoom in to give you an idea of the granularity. So if you look carefully, it's really hard to find a road that is not covered by our measurements. And this is the power of the project. Lots of people collecting data independently. For those of you who are interested, I'm going to go up a little bit to Fukushima. And this data is basically representing data over the past year or so. It is stationary, it is measured by driving and collected in the map. This is very much like what Google does for Street View. We're basically doing the same thing, but then for radiation. And here you can see this is Fukushima. And for those of you that are familiar, this is the actual nuclear power plant. The green line is currently the exclusion zone. This is still a no-go zone. The areas around it are recently being cleared. This is where most people in Fukushima live, in this area here. And what is interesting is that if you look carefully, you will see that areas here are kind of blue is like kind of low, yellow and white is extremely high. You can see that locations near to the power plant and locations far from the power plant can be lower and higher respectively. And that has been the problem of the whole measurement. Radiation, lots of people think it's like radio signals that, reverse square law, as further you get, less you get. This is matter that went up in the air, and the rain and snowfall distributed that radioactive matter. It is not radiating from the power plant. It is actually pollution on the surface, mostly on the surface people stand on, that is radiating. And because of that, unless you measure the whole area, you would not know where the stuff ended up. And that has been the start point of the project was, where is what? And through our project, we actually forced the Japanese government to redefine this area. They initially had said this area here is the no-go zone because they made a 20-kilometer circle around it. When we started measuring, we saw that has nothing to do with reality. And together with other groups that were measuring, we started to redefine the area that should be the no-go zone. Very important because it wouldn't have happened if there were no citizens that decided to go and do something about it. To be very precise, the Japanese government didn't measure outside that 20-kilometer zone at all. They only measured inside. It's kind of funny because there were no people inside the 20-kilometer zone. So we tried to, we decided we're going to measure where people are. So this gives you an idea of Japan today. I'm going to quickly switch to, wrong one, different project. Moment, hang in. Oh my God, it's hanging. Okay, forget that. We have a backup for that. Wanted to show you, here we go. All right. No. What I wanted to show you is kind of where we are outside of Japan, and so here you get an idea of measurements around the world. Actually, after we did the work in Japan and we made the kit available through Amazon and other channels, lots of people started building it. And to our surprise, lots of people started to measure initially in the US, lots of nuclear test sites, nuclear waste sites, all kind of other things that happened there. And over the last 2 years, we have seen tremendous amount of activity in Europe as well. I think some countries are pretty much getting covered as much as Japan is today. It's all volunteers measuring. So if you're interested in that, look up the map and you can get an idea what your street looks like. I want to talk about our fixed sensors, and that has to do with the Things network. Initially, we measured by driving around. It was really good to get a very quick idea of what is where. But then we also wanted to know, in one location, how is the radiation changing over time? And that's really important. As you may be aware, radiation has a half-life where the levels change over time. In the case of Fukushima, that is about 30 years for cesium-137. But there were all kind of other isotopes. And there's also the unknown effects of the ecosystem, how it deals with the radiation material. It actually is not so simple, and we learned that by measuring continuously over time. And so we started to build fixed sensors so that we could see the decay chain, but also we wanted to see if there was no new releases coming out of the nuclear plant. So we built various fixed sensors, and the most recent generation is what we call Solarcast, because it is solar powered, but it has a few other things. One of the main things we wanted to achieve, and we built lots of fixed sensors, and please understand our users are ordinary citizens like yourself. And most of these sensors end up in gardens or around houses. They're not put on utility poles or other public locations. So it creates new challenges as to what people kind of find acceptable or what they will do to install a sensor. So this being the third generation, we decided that it must be as simple as possible, and we wanted to create something that could be just left and without having a need for installation, cabling or power cabling or internet, no need for Wi-Fi access, so we're not going into people's private homes to snoop on their internet traffic. Something that's completely standalone, can be just left. You don't have to think, it also configures itself. So that is kind of what we call drop and forget, and the SolarCast sensor is designed with that as the main purpose. And what does this sensor do? Today, we started with radiation, but we have added particulate air quality sensors to the system. This is because lots of volunteers and people came to us and said, well, what about air quality? Can we do the same thing? So we've been working on that. It has a global wireless modem built in, so it's a phono modem that allows it to connect wherever it is in the world. It also has a LoRa WAN connectivity. And the way it works is it actually, first of all, is going to look if there is LoRa connectivity around it. If that is the case, then it will use that as main means of communication. If that is not the case, it will go to 3G. The 3G is also used for over-the-air updates. This system was designed about 2 years ago, and we deployed it a year ago actually in the US primarily and in Japan. This is one of the challenges, is waterproof. All our sensors are outdoor use only. We don't measure inside. The reason for that is we share the data. Everybody can see the data. It's not very meaningful to share data in people's houses because there are lots of other reasons things will be different, and it was not general purpose useful. Today we have a gentleman in the audience, Mr. Luka Mustafa, who is going to talk here tomorrow. He's waving his hand right now. He is the one, Luka is from Slovenia, and he has a wonderful factory there that does small series productions, and he helped us build this sensor last year. And I think tomorrow he's going to talk about some of his projects that are pretty exciting as well. But you will see there's lots of kind of open source community or open data community. You will see there's lots of synergies happening between how we design our sensors. Our designs are all open. You're more than welcome to go and build them. This is the SolarCast bathing in the sun. This is MIT Media Lab in Cambridge in the US. This is where we launched the sensor last year. And currently it is deployed. So what's in the box? This is always the question. So very quickly going to point out what's inside. You can, if you're interested after the talk, if you come and find me, I'll more than happy to show you exactly how it works. But here is the LoRa module sitting next to a phono module. You can see kind of a big motherboard, and we made this kind of big so that we could experiment with it. The modules can be replaced. This is important because LoRa US, LoRa Japan, etc. When we designed this, the multi-LoRa module didn't exist. So we wanted to be swappable so we could make it adjusted for the country we're in. And so for the phono module, it has lots of electronics to harvest the energy we get from the sun. And it has a GPS, and it has a small CPU that also does the Bluetooth communication. This is the air quality sensor, and this is kind of unique. It is a design we came up with on our own. It contains 2 commercially available PM, particulate matter sensors, and we put them inside the box, in the box. So that the air flow is kind of separated from the rest of the box. And the 2 sensors basically get the same airflow, and we're currently researching and figuring out how do these sensors work in the environment, and are they comparable or not? And one of the tricks in our project is that wherever we measure radiation, we actually use exactly the same sensor worldwide, so that you can compare levels between cities. Radiation sensors from different manufacturing or different types have different reactions to different isotopes. So if you don't have the same one, you can kind of compare it, but it becomes tricky once the isotopes are different. So that's why we decided to go for one single sensor, and we're trying to figure out right now what should be our standard sensor. And I can tell you that is not an easy puzzle, because I think the maturity of air quality sensors is not where the maturity is of radiation sensors. So there's lots of discrepancies in between manufacturers. We really don't know how they actually work inside. So this is a continued kind of experiment, and that's why we call ourselves citizen scientists. The only way to figure out is to do it. These sensors currently are deployed in Los Angeles mostly. Here you can see some of the sensors, and I'm not sure if my computer still will work. No, let's not bother. But if you go on the map, you can go to LA. You will find these dots. These dots kind of indicate the level of the sensor. there's 3 arrows, kind of. The left part of the arrow indicates radiation level. The center and the outer center kind of gives the indication of the 2 PM sensors. And if it is red, it means it is higher, and the direction of the arrow indicates is it going up or is it going down. So I'm not sure this is the best way to visualize it, but we spent lots of time figuring out how can we keep this kind of simple. So here you can kind of see this area, the air quality is getting worse. This area is going worse as well. So basically, LA, this was taken about this morning. It's getting worse at the moment. But what is interesting, though, is that you can kind of see that these sensors are kind of close to each other. And kind of see is that this here it is bad, here it is better. And that is kind of the thing we're trying to figure out. You know, as citizens, we want to kind of know what is it in my neighborhood. I don't care about your neighborhood. I want to know my neighborhood. And this is what most of our volunteers want. They want to know what's happening much closer to their homes or their schools. And we're trying to figure out that if you have many sensors in the city, does that tell a different story from having only a few government-sanctioned sensors that are so-called the official sensors? So far, we're still researching it, but I can tell you that actually we're seeing that the differences within the city are much bigger than we had expected. So that's that. The next sensor that I'm going to talk about is this box here. This actually is we call it the Solarcast Nano. It is the smaller version of the big box. And this one is a challenge. We're trying to make it smaller, easier to deploy, and smaller means smaller solar panel, which means you have to harvest energy, you have to use it much more wiser. This system here only does radiation at the moment. We're working on the air quality version of it, which has a little bit more challenge because of the power consumption. And here you can see the sensor. If you look very carefully, this is actually the Daiichi Fukushima power plant 2 kilometers away, where we recently installed this system. We built it last month and we installed it 2 weeks ago in an area that is exclusion zone. So normally you can't go in here, but we got permission from the Japanese government to put a sensor there. If you're interested in the project, we actually wrote a scientific paper about the project 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, in the Journal of Radiological Protection. It is an official peer-reviewed paper, very well read, actually. Normally, if you publish anything in this space, you get about 200 downloads. We got 7,000 downloads by now, and we also get excited. So this talks about how the project is organized. So if you really want to get into details, please read this. So now we get to the question, can I trust the data that I see? And this is increasingly becoming a problem. As the internet becomes so pervasive around us, we're getting serious problems with what we see is, can we trust that? And we're now living in the area of fake news, and it's really, how can we rebuild trust in the data we see? And it's a really big problem. I don't have the answer for it in terms of the bigger space, but Safecast is really trying to focus on the problem. How can we trust environmental data? So how can we just focus on that, and how does that work? 2 interesting things. It's almost unavoidable to talk about this person. Last year, when Trump presidency started, there was a riffraff going on about the Trump administration taking off specific data from the EPA website. That's the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. And that agency basically officially publishes the levels of air pollution, etc. And initially, he said he wouldn't do it, but in April last year, the data was removed from the website. And if you think about it, how much we take for granted in our society, even basic things about what the weather is outside becomes political. And so the question is what can we trust? And Safecast basically actually says, trust no one. That's really how we have organized our way we measure. And he said, well, how do you mean trust no one? And basically, what happened in Fukushima is that the Japanese people collectively lost trust in the Japanese government and TEPCO, the nuclear power operator, because they basically were not telling information, and it was poorly done, and people started to distrust. And the problem is if you have a central organization measure, the moment the trust is lost, your trust lost in all the data it collects. And even today in Japan, if you go to Fukushima, you meet people there, they still do not trust any of the data the Japanese government creates. So that is how easy or how hard it is to rebuild trust and how easy it is to lose trust. So what we do in Safecast is, what we did 2 fundamental things differently. We first of all gave volunteers these radiation loggers. And the key thing is that the people that get these loggers, they actually decide on their own that they want this. We don't even look for them. They find us on the internet, they get the device, and they start measuring. And so this is one thing. So the people that measure are people that we don't know, and the people that measure don't know the other people that measure. So this is one important thing. In other words, the people that measure actually have no foundation for trusting each other. There's no trust in the network. However, what we also do is the data that the loggers create are always going to be public domain. So whatever data you collect for Safecast is going to be public domain. It will not be sold, it will not be not published, it will be published. So what happens is that these people now randomly basically are going to walk around their cities measuring the quality in their environments. So as that happens, you get effects like this. Now, this happens to be Amsterdam, and we are kind of around here right now, but this is the center of Amsterdam. If you look carefully, you will see this is the central Dam Square, and here many volunteers have gone to this place to measure radiation. And as you can see the color is kind of homogeneous here, right? So now we have people that don't know each other, measure the same location, and coming with the same result. That actually creates a lot of trust out of people that don't know each other. So, because we assume that they're not influencing each other, the devices are operating similarly, and we're getting the same result. So this creates the trust in the network. So this is how we create trust out of no trust. And this is really fundamentally how Safecast works. It's also important, again, to repeat this, that Safecast as an organization does not influence where volunteers measure. And we use the principle of selfish thinking. All our volunteers measure where they have a worry or where they care. They're not going to measure somewhere where they, whatever. They focus on their own streets and areas they live. And that is a driving force that is much more powerful than somebody telling you to do something. People are wise and smart enough to figure out where they want to go. So this is how the system works. So we basically create trustful data because we use the randomness of how we have organized. And if you put that against a central organization like a government, this is not to say that governments necessarily are bad. Governments are made out of ourselves, right? We are citizens and governments are made out of ourselves. But what we can do is we can start to create checks and balances between what we are told and what we can see. And because the technology we have today, this is why, if you look at the whole LoRa revolution, all these devices becoming smaller, cheaper, and easier to program, we can make the devices that are high quality, that you can carry around, and you can go and do these things. If you think about Chernobyl 25, 30 years ago, none of that existed. We were told in Holland that, don't worry, everything is fine. Well, why? I have no idea why we were told that. It was interesting that the Dutch government at that time had great trust in the Russians. And we can verify these things ourselves now, and I think that's really important. So the last part I want to talk about is what we have learned along the way of the last 7 years. And I want to do that because I live in Japan, along, not the 7 samurai, but the 7 lucky gods of Safecast. If you've been to Japan or you know a little bit of Japanese culture, the 7 lucky gods in Japan are basically little lucky charms that people have at their homes, and each god is a protector of something, money, prosperity, health, etc. So I want to use these 7 gods to talk about 7 principles that we use in our project and how we organize ourselves. The most fundamental thing is that Safecast is a pro-data organization. So when we talk about measuring nuclear power plants, etc., people sometimes get confused and think that we're either a pro-nuclear or an anti-nuclear group. It really depends on what how you'll want to look at it. We are none of that. We are focused on making data publicly available and as good as possible. That data itself is important to fuel discussions in our society, and that is the whole purpose of it. Let's have discussions based on data, and let's not have discussions based on a pre-decided outcome. And polarization in our society is becoming increasingly, in my mind, a bigger problem. And we kind of believe that having objectively collected data can help us to have a more structured and a more balanced discussion. Data is also baseline. If we don't measure, for example, the radiation levels around here, and it would be a nuclear disaster, we would have no way to compare. So how do we create baselines of data? Or same thing for air quality, same thing for temperature and other things. We need baselines to be able to compare, because that's how our brains are wired. We don't know what, if I tell you it's 0.1 microsieverts an hour in this room right now, you will say, oh wow, it's more than 0. But you would not know what it means. But if I tell you that is the same in almost all locations in Europe, then you say, oh, okay, that is normal, all right? So the reference is very important, so pro data. The other thing that is very important in the project, all our data is public domain. We do not sell the data, we do not charge for data. All data collected by our volunteers will be public domain forever, and all data will be downloadable forever. So this is the very, very core principle. This allows many amazing things to happen. We have researchers, we have artists, we have governments, we have all kind of people, companies that use our data for all kind of different purposes. Lots of people use it for research, people use it to compare, obviously citizens use it to check their own environments. So open data is a very big thing, and we try to influence universities, governments, and other institutions that are funded by public money to publish their data publicly always. And interestingly enough, and sadly enough, that's entirely not the case today. Many universities do not publish research data. Many governments don't publish the data. We just talked about the US government because it's always easy to talk about somebody else's government. But in reality, the same thing applies to most countries, unfortunately. The other principle we use is called deploy and die, or deploy or die. Sometimes it is deploy and die. But the whole idea here is that experimentation and doing things is a whole lot more important than talking and thinking. I'm an engineer by training, which means that sometimes we think too much and we don't do. And we always want to build the perfect system. But I've taught myself not to build the perfect system, but build a system that I can use now to go to the next step. So we work in very quick cycles. If you think about agile programming, we do the same thing in Safecast, but then for systems. Very quickly we deploy. And the key thing, because we're a citizen project, is it is not very predictable how our sensors are going to be used. So unless we put it out there and we work with people that are using them, we can't make them in the way that they become successful. So we deploy, we find out what happens. If it doesn't work, we go to the next round, next round, next round. That also means that if you look at our hardware, you will see that most of our hardware is made out of little tiny breakout boards that you can buy from Adafruit or SparkFun. And the reason for that is we do not want to spend time manufacturing anything. So we make the PCB boards, you put it all together, but we don't spend time making that in a perfect, beautiful, integrated system. And that way we can move 10 times faster if we would do it the other way around. Another thing is, if you think about it, if you want to innovate, you want to reduce the cost of failure. So failure is part of innovation. So we allow ourselves to fail happily as long as that moves us to the next round. Do it yourself. So I already mentioned, so our hardware is basically things assembled together. From the breadboard to our systems is a very small step. And it also allows things to be made by our volunteers. So all our systems are kind of kits. And here, this is in Fukushima. These are volunteers in the city of Aizu that are building the radiation detectors. It takes them about 4 to 5 hours to put them together. And I kind of call it crowd manufacturing. And instead of trying to come up with a whole finished system, you can have these things on the road. It takes maybe a month between building, thinking of it and getting the devices deployed and built. That's much faster than anything else I've seen. Anti-disciplinary is a very important thing. Our project, all our volunteers that work on a project are from very different parts in terms of their backgrounds and their training. And I'm an engineer, so if I would build something, I would use my engineer brain. But on our team, we have artists, we have scientists, we have people that are in social science and other things, and we all work together as a team. And that allows our devices to look very differently. They don't look engineery, they kind of look cool. They're transparent. We have artists, and this is an example, and this is an artist in Hong Kong that downloaded our data and created an interactive media project, artwork, where he used the radiation levels to create a virtual city that was kind of between Hong Kong and Fukushima. He actually won a prize on the Ars Electronica Festival in Austria last year with this artwork. So this kind of mixing of things creates very different things. And I think we have lots of engineers in the room, but I urge people to try to work with interdisciplinary teams, try to get different things together, and you get very different results than what you would expect normally. The other thing, which I kind of mentioned earlier, pull over push. So instead of trying to push things to our volunteers, tell people what to do, we basically have volunteers pull themselves into the project, decide where they want to measure. We also kind of work, our project is organized. We have a big, we started with a big channel on Skype, but now we're using Slack instead. But we have one big open communication channel where we pull in expertise from all over the world to get our project the way it's going. So we get help from very famous researchers in the nuclear sciences that we pull in at the right time to make sure that whatever we do actually makes sense. And that pulling is the power of the internet. If if you don't know how that works, then you don't know how the internet works. You can basically pull everything at the right time to you, rather than go the other way around and push people around. This also, I think, is one of the reasons why the project has been so successful. Is that we basically are almost like a super flat, organized, random. It almost looks random sometimes. Organized group of volunteers where we have very limited amount of hierarchy. The last philosophy and the last principle I want to talk about, and at the end of my talk, is about the principle of community over device. And I've been following lots of projects very similar to Safecast, where we want to measure the environment, we want to work with volunteers and stuff like that. And unfortunately, many projects I've seen have always kind of suffer the problem is it's very exciting in the beginning, and then a year later, the website is gone, the devices are useless and cannot be used. And the reason for that is that lots of projects are too obsessed and focused on the technology and the device and trying to sell the device, and ignore the importance of building a community that is going to do something with those devices and data, and that is the power. So focusing on the community is a whole lot more important than getting the best device and the cheapest device. Actually, our devices are not the cheapest devices. They're very good, but they're not the cheapest. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that the measurements that people take are credible and are calibrated and everything. But the most important thing is they mean something to people. They are usable in the communities. And I sometimes say that if you look at those projects that go through, that are device-centric, they're kind of the internet of nothing, right? So instead of an internet of things, we basically build all the things, we connect them to the internet, but after some time, they become useless bricks and gadgets. Even large companies that are very famous in the internet world, they have created lots of bricks already. And you can Google, there's even websites that now list them all up. But that is something that we want to avoid at all costs. How can we make sure that the thing keeps on running and keeps on being useful? And if you look at the community of Safecast, it first of all starts with citizens. This is when we started. You can see this is a small little car. This is in Fukushima. You can see the Geiger counter is on the car window, and these people here are volunteers that are driving this car around, and they drove every single street in their own city. These are our future. These are children. We do lots of projects with high school students and university students and primary school students, where we teach them about measuring, doing things yourself, environmental issues. These are the press. We spend lots of time talking to press. They come to us, ask for help. We also get interviewed. That's nice. But we spend lots of time helping people to get better information. We have lots of information that we have verified, and we're sharing that. We also work with companies. Now, this is, if you're not from Japan, you would not know what, maybe you can give it a guess, but this is the Japanese postal bike. Okay? There are 30,000 of these, 60,000 of these in Japan that every day deliver mail. And we figured out a way to team up with the post office in Japan and put our sensor on the motorbikes. An amazing way. They had a reason to do it. We obviously had a reason to do it because we got great coverage. And there are all kind of crazy ways you can team up with companies and other people that are already driving around. In our case, driving around is very important, and are willing to actually partner up. This was a partnership that had no money involved, zero money involved. This was truly the post office volunteering to drive around. Safecast volunteered to make sure they had devices on the motorbikes. This is, for some of you, you may recognize the background. This is the Fukushima power plant. This is us, and we're standing in for, this is a month ago. This is myself. And we were invited by the operator to come and measure and verify, and this is an ongoing story. And we hope to one day install our sensors inside the power plant so we can report live. We work with the IEA, for example. We not necessarily work with politicians, but politicians do use what we do as their policies. This is a politician in Taiwan. And the final thing I want to talk about is, if you want to learn more about the project, go to our website. We have a large document that describes all aspects of the project, fully open, and you can study that. But this, I want to say, if you're doing something like this, engage with your environment wherever you are. You can figure out where this is. And I would thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much.